come on this screen. If you look here, they're there. So Erica Fisher-Licht, her first qualification of performance is that performance comes into being by the bodily co-presence. Okay, so this co-presence, and this is not, people have talked about this over the last 2 days, this co-presence of actors and spectators, or in my case, in the case of dialogic performance, by the co-presence of all participants, and specifically by their encounter and interaction. And note that Fisher-Licht doesn't talk about it as being a convivial interaction. It could be an antagonistic interaction. It's the interaction itself. Lay over Judith Herman's first qualification of trauma recovery. She writes, the core experiences of psychological trauma are disempowerment and disconnection from others. Recovery can take place only within the context of relationships. It cannot occur in isolation, right? So we have this notion of this co-presence as both the importance of this in performance and the importance of this in trauma recovery process. And so then we start to look at what does this co-presence mean? How does this presence on the street, in these ephemeral communities, in these ephemeral public locations that are singular and not necessarily not able to be repeated, because each time there's a different set of actors that are co-creating this public. That's the first one. Fisher-Licht says, while performance is transitory and ephemeral, whatever arises comes into being in the here and now, and it's experienced as present and sometimes particularly intensely, right? So that's another quality of performance, and we think about performance art and the kind of work that I do. So it's this notion, it's transitory, it's ephemeral, but it's present, and sometimes very, very richly so. Judith Herman comes along. Well, she wrote way before Erica Fisher-Licht did, so it's a little bit of a flip, but we're in a context where I'm talking mostly about performance. Otherwise, if I was in a context where I was talking to psychologists, I'd probably flip the script. But Judith Herman, the guiding principles of trauma recovery are the restoration of safety and empowerment. So the first stage of recovery is safety and empowerment. Recovery does not mean complete freedom from the past or the post-traumatic effects, but it's the ability to live in the present without being overwhelmed by the thoughts and the feelings of the past. So it's an integration of that traumatic memory so that we can live more fully in the present. Meaning is co-emergent with the performance. It doesn't transmit pre-given meanings. It's not a theatrical event where you come in and you know exactly what's going to unfold. What happens on the street in these exchanges, in these story exchanges, create the meaning in the present moment. It's a co-emergent with that experience. Judith Herman says, in the latter stages of recovery, which are marked by reconnection and commonality, trauma survivors construct a coherent system of meaning and belief that encompasses the story of the trauma, which can transform the meaning of their personal tragedy. And that new meaning, right, that non-pre-given meaning in this process can become a basis for social action and community connection. And then the fourth is Erica Fisher-Licht says performances are characterized by their eventness, and obviously she's making reference to Bakhtin and the notion of eventness. And Judith Herman says, though the resolution of trauma is never complete, it is often sufficient for the survivor to turn her attention from the tasks of recovery to ordinary life, to achieving a sense of commonality with others. And for these individuals, the best indications of the resolution is their increased capacity to take pleasure in life, engage more fully in the eventfulness and of the present and the task of creating a future, which if you go back to the notion of eventfulness, it is that possibility of being aware of what's arising in the moment with an anticipation of the future, right? And so trauma creates anxiety as an anticipation of future fear, and this recovery process is an anticipation of future wellness, right? So taken all together, I suddenly understood that for over the 30 years that I've been developing these works, My personal and familiar experiences as a second-generation Holocaust survivor are not, how shall I say, not neutral to this whole process, right? And I had known that there was always within my work a process of my own healing, right? What I understood in this process of putting these two theories together is that it was never only about the art performance, and it was never only about myself, right? So the creation of the performances and the communities that have enlivened them, however ephemeral and transitional, have been direct engagements in lifelong healing from intergenerational violence, post-memories. Somebody was mentioning that yesterday, post-memories, the theory that one generation's experiences can be experienced by the second and third generation, even though the second and third generation has never lived those experiences, but they're absorbed as if they were their memories. Forced displacement and internalized state-sponsored atrocities. And curiously enough, almost to a one, every single individual who came and shared a story with me, both in the first iteration and in the second iteration, whether it was the survivors of the Pinochet regime, the 60s scoop with First Nations being taken from their homes, even after the residential schools, domestic violence, involuntary migration, xenophobia, suicide, all of these individuals called up trauma narratives while in conversation with me as we simultaneously leaned into the healing. Sorry. So we don't quite see it very well. But so it's my understanding, and here's what I'm proposing, that logical presence, the ephemeral live occurrence, the co-emergent meaning, and the eventness in live art performance are vital not only to performance art, they are equally conducive to personal and collective wellness. And that these four experiences can bring into being the precise set of resilience skills necessary in transitioning from trauma to recovery in both the private lives of the individuals and within the public sphere. And I'm just going to end by saying that next week I'm going to be presenting a second part of this in Quebec City as part of the conference that's looking at the re-articulation of the Quebec City public art policy. And with this established, with this idea that performance art can be overlaid with this process of wellness, development of wellness, this anticipation of wellness within the public sphere, the contribution that I'm going to make next week in Quebec City is going to link this to what I see as perhaps the most significant aspect of trauma that we're facing right now collectively around the world, which is environmental trauma. And so how can we understand the work of performance art in the public sphere as supporting resilience, the development of resilience for individuals who are experiencing, whether it's acute or chronic environmental trauma due to extreme weather events, floods, etc., or to this anxiety about we have 11 years before we can't do anything to change our environment. And so having been able to establish this connection gives me that opportunity to think about it within this other realm, aside from what, what's her name? Give me a second. Shoshana Feldman described as the 20th century as the century of trauma, to perhaps seeing the 21st century as the century of resilience. And so what is the role of performance art in these ephemeral communities, which, as we established over the last 2 days, has the possibility of disruption in the best possible way, right? The possibility of opening new opportunities for different kinds of relationships to come into being. And I believe that that's my time. I have 3 minutes left. Oh my goodness. So I will end by just quoting something from Jan Cohen-Cruz's Radical Street Performance text. And she, in this book, Jan Cohen-Cruz writes about radical street performance and talks about the pervasive pattern in the persistence of street performance in periods of social flux, either leading up to, during, or just after a shift in the status quo. And what she says is that in moments of social upheaval and political uncertainty, we force our way into the streets to reappraise the social, economic, and political status quo. When, quote, one needs most to disturb the peace, street performance creates visions of what society might be and arguments against what it is. And so in both the instances of Présence and Présence Revisited, 20 years apart, the kinds of issues that emerged, the kinds of conversations, the kinds of stories that emerged resonated on the same register that I was working on, right? It was the after effects of genocide. It was the after effects of political terror or domestic abuse or intergenerational violence. Those were the registers that I was playing with and healing from as a second generation Holocaust survivor, as a survivor of childhood abuse and childhood terror. And so with this shift towards looking at what I think is the next, really, really significant focus, possibly for the rest of my artistic career, which is on climate justice, the register, I believe, is going to change. And so it touches on the new works that I've been doing, also within the public sphere, also looking at this relationship between how the eventfulness, the co-presence, the possibility of creating new relational dynamics through performance are as vital to performance art as they are as dealing with the kinds of issues that are most critical in our world today. So thank you very much.
Oui, il faudrait plus. On recommence par ça. Oui, t'as ça, tu l'as dans la main. Ok, regarde, on va faire. Oui, l'inverse. Je vais le poser. Oups. C'est pas la présentation. Is this okay with you? I thought it was better from here. So, c'est toi, Gina? Oui, merci. You're gonna have to sit here because of all the mics. Attends un peu, tire-le vers toi parce qu'il est précaire. Ok, c'est bon. Ça, c'est bon. Je vais retrouver ta... There you are. Yeah, you will go. Donc, merci pour cette présentation absolument fascinante. Donc, on continue la matinée. Je vais présenter en anglais encore une fois. Ruth Vazacurley works as an academic developer in the University of South Australia's Teachings Innovation Unit, where she focuses on digital teachings. Her research concerns visual culture and contemporary art, as well as urban design, urban studies, and cultural geographies. Her interests push her to study discourses and stories related to public art and to examine its policies, financing, and management in order to account for the effects of those discourses on urban, social, and spatial relations. Merci.
Good morning. Can you hear me? A little quiet. Is that better? Okay, I have to negotiate some screens. Okay, good. In Australia, it's become customary at public events to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the events take place. For me, in Adelaide, it's the Kaurna people who have a past and continuing relationship to country as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region. Here in Montreal, which Google tells me is the traditional land of the Kanukahaga Nation, among several others, and the gathering place of many people, I'd similarly like to acknowledge the prior and continuing relationship of First Nation peoples to this place. Like others, I'd also like to thank Suzanne for the opportunity to be involved here today, and thank the rest of the committee and the wonderful team who've made this event happen. So thank you. I've also appreciated the many deeply considered and argued papers presented so far at this symposium, and Devorah's is a perfect example. So I feel the need to warn you that I'm not presenting a clearly resolved paper. I hope you'll bear with me as I try and use this presentation and this symposium more generally as an opportunity to start thinking aloud through some of the shifts in discourse around public art in recent years, and reflect on a proposition I raised more than a decade ago regarding the need for a shared research agenda that might involve simply seeking to know more about public art, about its conception and production, as well as its reception and effects. I'm going to start by looking backwards also, briefly setting out some background, some of my own past research into public art in a particular geographical and historical context that perhaps helps explain why I've been so persistent in continuing to use that term public art rather than many of the other strategic possibilities that exist. This discussion, I hope, raises issues, that discussion raises issues which have driven and sustained the operation of public art research, a loose web-based social network and long-standing personal project that's focused on collating, sharing and reflecting upon academic, professional and practice-led investigations into the history, discourses, practices and effects of art in public spaces. I'm going to try and give an overview of the trajectory of that project, Public Art Research, since 2002, and briefly consider some of the audiences, the users and participants in that network, if network it is, we'll see. And finally, we'd like to try and think about what's changed over this period, to reconsider the question perhaps of what a shared agenda for public art might look like or require from us. So let's just start by making clear that I've framed my own research around the notion of public art as one that's discursively created and reproduced in plural and contingent ways, both linguistically and materially, across multiple different sites of knowledge formation. I'm not using it to refer strictly to artefacts, either virtual or material, or as a term with a fixed or desirable definition. It's not one confined to an autonomous realm of fine art. It's perhaps saying the obvious. I've been especially interested in looking at how public art, or rather the constellation of related terms, has been put to use by diverse interests. In my research in the mid-2000s, I explored the specific use of the term public art in an Australian policy and practice context, which was characterised at that time by an emerging local government public art sector. Came late, I think, to Australia as a local government activity. Programs from both federal and state governments in Australia throughout the 80s and 90s had targeted local government as a new site of responsibility for cultural policy and arts programming. A new array of public art curators, program managers, policy writers and administrators were grappling with limited resources and competing demands. Demands that included bringing new target constituencies into contact with quality artwork, responding to an ever more diverse range of art forms, new materials, technologies and practices, with new opportunities and new commissioning models, strengthening employment and professional development opportunities for artists, and demonstrating the utility of art and artists in solving problems, creating visual or social cohesion, for example, and supporting economic development. Recurrent anxieties concern definitions of public art, of art or culture, the preservation and extension of high and low culture, and the insertion of commercial imperatives into policy regimes redolent with the romantic legacy of the isolated artist, the transcendent value of art, and its public and economic utility. A strong advocacy culture dominated in this environment, embedded in calls for the professionalisation of public art, artists and art managers, for agreed definitions of public art, standards of practice, and quality or other evaluation indicators. While I've worked in both academic and professional roles to prepare guidelines, develop training for artists and administrators, and promote best practice, I've consistently argued for the need to simply know more about what public art is and does, its interactions and effects, aided by new or repurposed theoretical methodologies and tools, particularly from geography, anthropology, and urban planning. Not just in Australia, I believe, there seemed to be a distinct neglect of contemporary public art by art critics, art historians, and academic publishers. Public art was plainly not art in some cases. It was bad art, or it was worthy but flawed. Public art was compromised, whether it was lacking in criticality, tainted by utility and messy social relations. Arguments frequently stated with recourse to modernist arguments about artistic autonomy and authenticity. But it may well be that research was out there but was just hard to find. Grant Kester, for example, recently noted that throughout the 1990s he struggled to get his book Conversation Pieces published because of a distinct lack of interest from academic publishers. It wasn't published until 2004, when the social practice boom started to take off in the US. Kester's also commented on the changing nature of critical and scholarly publication, noting that pre-internet, the hegemonic power of a handful of journals and editors was profound. The World Wide Web from the 90s was opening up new opportunities for disseminating research. Blogs, journals, websites, institutional research repositories. It allowed new visibility to projects, institutions, documents and practices, and new opportunities for data gathering, connection and comparison, locally, nationally and globally. In conjunction with a vast grey literature of policy, guidelines, reports, project documentation, marketing and so on, research into and with public art was being conducted within and was shaped by this landscape where there was both too much material and too little coordination and comparison of research and information, with impacts for trying to even imagine what a national or international public art research agenda might look like, or if it's desirable. In about 2002, I began a modest initiative to bring together in my immediate circle people, knowledge and practices around public art using the resources of the internet. I began to collate and disseminate public art related news, opportunities and events sourced online and offline, with the aim of bringing together the practitioner, professional and academic stakeholders, making visible the work being done in my own local context as well as elsewhere, and to promote research into public art that responded to contemporary theoretical and artistic approaches to public art. In short, I guess, I sought to create a public or publics for critical public art research rather than for public art advocacy, and to help build a knowledge base from which research agendas could be shared and discussed. Don't worry, I'm going to be very brief running through things. Public art research began then as emails to a distribution list, including artists, educators, agency and program managers, and a handful of fellow research students. From there, it evolved into a GeoCities website and a PDF bulletin, and later a WordPress blog. It's currently operating as a Facebook group with around 540 members and slowly increasing. These are obviously tiny in the internet, in the global world. So I'm presenting it as it is. Oh, yeah. Okay, GeoCities was an early web hosting service created in 1994. It allowed the creation of free websites, which was a radical thing. According to Wikipedia, at the time that it was closed down by Yahoo in October 2009, there were at least 38 million GeoCities pages, and it was the third most visited web address on the internet. I first built the website to house a research grant acquittal report and to more widely share its appendix of resources. This was supplemented by additional pages of public art related information organised by country and or the nature of the resource, publications, research projects, databases, art agencies, and so on. In addition, the site was used to house the publication Public Art Research Bulletin, which took up the work of the email list by canvassing Australian public art projects, practice, events, policy and research directions, and providing links to international, providing links to international research and practice. You can see the bulletin was pretty basic, chiefly text and hyperlinks. It occasionally included images and original writing from myself and colleagues, usually fellow research students. These bulletins continue to be available and are still being viewed, funny enough, on the WordPress site, which was created in 2011. A return to academic employment for me in 2011 at RMIT in Melbourne provided me with the impetus to copy and update resources from the defunct GeoCities website in a format that enabled more reflective writing opportunities, as well as a return to the ad hoc posting of news, opportunities and events. The website also enabled an expanded audience and a greater feedback to me about usage, with the ability to track views and visitors, as well as more easily solicit feedback and comments. The site was linked to social media channels via Twitter since 2013 and Facebook since 2015. As I've noted, the WordPress site is still available, but hasn't had new posts since early 2017, late 2016. The Public Art Facebook group was created in early February with a current membership of about 540. There's a slow but steady increase in that membership. So far about 135 a year, but it has little boosts. It's going up at the moment. Over the last 12 months, about 340 of those 500 odd members have been actively engaged in some way in viewing, reacting, commenting, to a much lesser extent actually posting information or comment or feedback projects. I have no data about the visitors or views of that group by non-members, unlike a Facebook page, which gives administrators some of that detail, or without, I'm yet to see what data is still available through the Facebook Graph API, which, as we know, has gone under a bit of scrutiny in recent years about what Facebook member data can be shared. Okay, what I do have is a range of engagement data for the WordPress site in terms of views and distinct visitors. Even though there's nothing being posted on there, you probably can't read that it's gone from, it's still having a kind of about 200 hits a month. Over its lifetime, up until May, it's had 19,000 odd visitors and 40,000 odd views. those visitors come from IP addresses anyway, largely in Australia, US, UK and Canada, but also Italy, Japan, France, Germany and Hong Kong. In the peak period, which was 2014, there were about 5,500 visitors. Again, mainly from Australia, US, UK and Canada, but also, you know, there's a good spread across the globe. And in 2018, when posting has ceased on that site, we're still getting traffic from a wide range of sites. Clearly beyond the number of subscribers onto the site, which is about 190. Okay. So, what do I know about Facebook membership and WordPress membership, rather than the actual usage or hit rates on the site? Facebook tells me that the members that have provided that information, something about the country, gender and their age group. 2/3 describe themselves as female. As you would expect, again, Australia, US, Canada and New Zealand are in the top 10 member locations, but also India, Philippines and more recently Pakistan. Okay, I've presumed a strong overlap in membership of the Facebook group with two other open groups related to public art, based on my personal networks and the predominance of Melbourne-based members. Firstly, one site driven by staff from the RMIT University Masters of Arts and Public Space in Melbourne, and the second, a Melbourne-based public art officer and curator leads a group called Public Art Curators. If I just look at those public art groups, I can see that, contrary to my expectations, about 300 of the group members are not members of those other two, but about so 200 odd are. 240 members are also a member of one or more other of these groups. If I add in the WordPress site subscriptions, then it starts to look a little bit more like this. I can see that there's a very small crossover across the 4 different groups. You can see that the members have clustered into 4 groups. We're just looking at the membership of a group, so there's no member-member relationships here. What I also see from this is that there's a large number of members with no link, as I've already indicated, no links out. Say that again, with no links to each other. This is probably a bit clearer in the Gephi version, which shows the darker colours show that there's a relationship of more than one. People are linked to more than one site. And black before, black shows where there are 4 links. So a person is a member of those 4 different groups. It doesn't tell me anything about these wider networks, clearly. It doesn't tell me anything about betweenness, about the relationships between members or between members and other groups. But it's kind of a pointer to where some further information might be found, I think. What I want to do is shift that conversation a bit, really, to think about what am I looking at, what's going on. Fred Turner, professor in communication at Stanford, argues post-World War II, liberal intellectuals sought to develop new theories of personal and interpersonal collaboration, new visions of the open, tolerant and democratic self, and new models of the media that could facilitate it. Inspired by Norbert Wiener's 1950, The Human Use of Human Beings, he says, counterculturalists and technologists alike joined together to reimagine computers as tools for personal liberation, the building of virtual and alternative communities, and the exploration of bold new social frontiers. With the world imagined as a feedback system of layered and distributed information exchanges, Vina's vision of cybernetics was one in which computers would better enable and support the free action of individuals, free from the top-down control or propaganda of governments. Information systems would break down social and geographical hierarchies and bureaucracies. The development of the internet and even of Facebook and other contemporary social network services, while privately owned and commercially driven, emerged out of this digital utopianism. In 2017, Zuckerberg, for many reasons perhaps, represented Facebook's mission to connect the world. The most important thing we at Facebook can do is develop the social infrastructure to give people the power to build a global community that works for all of us. For the past decade, Facebook has focused on connecting friends and families. Our next focus will be developing the social infrastructure for community, for supporting us, for keeping us safe, for informing us, for civic engagement, for inclusion for all. By contrast, in his 2018 book, Anti-Social Media, Siva Vaidyanathan argues, if you wanted to design a machine to distribute propaganda to millions of people, distract them from important issues, energize hatred and bigotry, erode social trust, undermine respectable journalism, foster doubts about science, and engage in massive surveillance all at once, it would look a lot like Facebook. For Vaidyanathan, Facebook's characteristic features crowd out other opportunities, in particular those characteristics, he refers to those characteristics of scale. Currently about 1.5 billion people log in daily to Facebook, with about 2.3 billion regular monthly users across the platforms of Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram and Messenger, all owned by Facebook. Its other characteristics are its highly efficient, accurate and profitable advertising system built on user surveillance and algorithmic systems of amplification, views, clicks and likes, which favour engagement around highly emotional content. Facebook's financial success relies on motivating ostensibly authentic individual and personal expression. Jonathan Albright's forensic work, tracing the spread of fake news online in the 2016 US elections, has shown how platforms such as Facebook serve to rapidly amplify misinformation as well as information, while at the same time they provide a mechanism for third parties to gather data to track and target users across the internet. Albright has plotted an extensive micro-propaganda network reliant on a whole ecosystem of technologies in which Facebook plays just one part. Social media researchers more widely are stressing the need to pay attention, not simply to individual platforms, but to the bigger ecology or interplay of formal and informal media, as well as smaller local geographical and cultural differences or similarities in the way that these are used. The Why Do We Post research project led by anthropologist Daniel Miller approached just this project, investigating the role of social media in people's everyday lives in locations across the globe. The study argues that social media has created new spaces for sociality, allowing for different sizes of audience and degrees of privacy. It identified social media as somewhere where people feel they live, not just a means of communication. So let's try and think about, we could try and think about what this sociality looks like or means for the network of public art research. There are questions of scale, identity, and privacy, commitments to reciprocity by participants, and a shared repertoire of knowledge and practices. What now then could be the shared knowledge and skills of public art researchers? What now are the pressing concerns? We could ask about digital public art specifically, but what isn't bound up with the digital as Miller and others have written. For many, it's now just the space in which we live our lives. There's been a long tradition of scholarly and artistic work recognising the implications for art of new media environments, much of which we've already heard mentioned throughout this conference. Mel Jordan, just as one example, recently noted that in the early 1990s, pre-internet and Facebook, William Mitchell's analysis of public art as imagery shifted public art into the realm of mass media, with public accessibility no longer a spatial issue, and with publicity enabled through the proliferation of mass images. The field of digital humanities also offers some insights into changing future research agendas for the nature and practices of institutions, research and art making, highlighting especially the emergence of the changing relations of access and control, including relations of expert and non-expert, producer, consumer. I'm there, trust me.
I didn't know if you saw me.
Thank you. New forms of mediation and translation, such as new forms of knowledge curation, rather than the production of new things. New objects of knowledge and new research methodologies, thinking about patterns versus meaning, or processes versus content, broad versus deep strategies, different kinds of temporal objects and different temporalities. New disciplinary formations even, and new environments, physical, both physical and non-physical. We could also add new infrastructures into this mix, as digital practices are inevitably knotted into the fabric of real spaces. We could also add the range of old and new alliances of interests that are brought to bear in the digital realm, in this new space. I just want to finish with a note from a 2018 paper by Martin at the back there. Hello, Martin. 2018 paper, Digital Geographies of Public Art, New Global Politics, by Martin Zabracki and Jason Luger. They make their own case for a detailed research agenda into art and the digital sphere, one that attends to politics and agency, and the conceptual and ethical implications of politicizing art in the digital peer-to-peer sphere. I've obviously listed many things, but I guess I'm wanting to leave it there because I'm keen to hear if there's any thoughts now or in the future from any of you in response to that kind of idea. That's it. Thank you. Pardon?
I'm sorry, I didn't want to stress
No,
you out. I
you're
didn't know
great.
if you saw
You're
me,
good.
so just waving. Okay. Yeah. And I'll find yours.
Just it's this one here. Okay, Montreal. Is that? Yep.
Oh, it's the pink one.
Pink.
And then we present this. And the arrows would be the ones.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Wonderful. On va donc poursuivre avec notre dernière présentation de la matinée. I'll go in English again. Michelle Gay is an artist, designer, and researcher. She holds a Master of Fine Arts from the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design University and a Master of Information Science from the University of Toronto. She has been an urban planning activist in the City of Toronto for over 14 years, lobbying for affordable life and workspaces for research and creation, public spaces, and urban design, which is forward thinking and inclusive. She teaches in the Graduate Studies Department at the Ontario College of Art and Design University. Barbara Rauch, just à côté, artist and scholar, pursues a studio practice around the topics of empathy, consciousness studies, and more lately, the manifestations of anthropocentric environmental ethics. She's co-director of the Data Materialization Studio Lab in the Digital Media Research and Innovation Institute at OCAD University and teaches in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies and Graduate Studies. Merci.
Okay. So can you hear me? I know I have a very soft voice. Thank you for inviting us to this conference. It's wonderful. No, excuse me.
No, it's okay. It's just I have you both.
Oh,
There you go. It's for the streaming.
We're very honored to be part of this panel today. Thank you, Deborah and Ruth. Those were both awesome papers. So hopefully we can maintain the effort. So our talk today is called Exploring Digital Archive as a Speculative Public Exhibition Space. So let me just get myself organized here as well with the speaker's notes. So we've just been introduced to Barbara and myself, so we'll continue on. We'll just start with some high-level considerations in our working methods. So through our practices, we ask, how does the studio practice change or respond to sustainability and material concerns, such as the socio-political and ecological questions of the Anthropocene, the situations of the post-studio, post-exhibition, post-art storage even, and post-materiality, and considers the changing platforms for exhibiting and sharing research, and then asks, how can contemporary studio practices negotiate new and emerging technological systems and platforms, and how can we curate, interact, and experience digital artifacts? So as makers and researchers, we're interested in creating work that is about positing questions and is speculative, may operate outside of time and location constraints, such as the physical gallery space, considers found materials as a strategy or act of making, and Barbara here offers gestures, fictional and collaborative activities with material and culture, and Michelle, me, I think about recently speculative infrastructural planning because of that history there that Gina just said. And I like to ask, what if artists participated in things like urban planning for cities of the future? So this did not move forward. Oh yeah, so our overview today, we're just going to review 2 case studies of digital works that have material beginnings in some aspects, look at some speculative metadata for describing digital works, and then consider the potential of an artist-developed metadata schema and the digital archive as a public exhibition space. And this is a kind of a thought experiment as well. So on to our case studies here. Gina mentioned that for the last 14, 15 years, I've participated as an urban planning activist and artist within this group. So this meant working to develop new spaces for artist creation, production, exhibition, back to the storing of art, that idea. And this included pressuring our city, the City of Toronto, to protect public space, potentially to be activated by artists as well. So the area that I live in Toronto was under huge pressure and was historically the affordable precinct where artists lived and worked and set up studios. This is not a new story, obviously. And private developers in the city planning departments were looking to develop these areas. Artists were being pushed out. So when thinking about all of these bureaucratic details with my fellow activists, I became interested in the future city and developments and possibilities. So one of the many questions around urban planning is how to engage non-planners in these important discussions. So with climate change looming over us as well, I was asking, how can we, regular citizens, pressure developers and city planners to think about sustainability? And like any large city, as I just mentioned, artists' studios were getting smaller and smaller, and we're getting pushed out. So skipping years ahead now into this project, in my studio, I began producing what I was considering these low-tech, low-fidelity, small-scale models that you see on the screen here to just spur thinking about, near future cities, buildings, and infrastructures. And my models, since I'm not an architect, are very propositional, very, very loose, acting not as instructions for a building, but to prod thinking and prompt questions like what could change our thinking about infrastructures and designs for our future cities. So an encapsulation of my studio project had a few simple steps: collect materials, and it was basically junk, like dollar store junk and packaging from consumer goods, stuff off the street. Then develop this list of infrastructures and buildings, and there's some examples on the screen here, such as a giant movable beehive, a spinning communication system, a sled for moving clouds, things like that, on and on. Then with my glue gun and my junk, I created these models that you see on the screen here. Then step 4 was to document these new models in some digital format for future use. And then the important point was then to throw away the original models. So many models have now been produced, but my project got scuppered quite quickly in that I couldn't determine which digital representation of the model was the most correct. So this image here, I'm kind of asking through my camera, which point of view tells the story of this object best? This led to continuing questioning how exactly to digitize the artifact. So here's just another attempt. It's an alternative view, which is a simple GIF animation. Does that tell a different story? And then the questions arose from this early phase were, how do these objects function as physical and material objects, as images, and then as digital objects? So I note that the grouping or set of forms that you just saw, they kind of act like a font, like letters of an alphabet. They can be kind of compiled and create relationships like words or phrases. How could they be used as visual prompts, visual questions, or visual propositions? And finally, then, how do I share these or use or present these lo-fi models as digital artifacts? So the next step, because I'm throwing these models out, was to digitize them. So I created a set of digital models. So looping back to that original conceit, it was to make, document in digital manner, throw away. So this next section just explores some other digitization tests. So this one, I'm just going to focus on this cloud sled. So this is cloud sled. So the image on the right, we were introduced to just a minute ago as a GIF animation. The image on the left is now this exported view of a mesh triangulation created through a photogrammetry process. So just a 360 view of the object. Some surprising artifacting started happening through the software and the algorithms, and things seem to happen in digital space which don't occur in real space. The cloud sled seems to have attached itself to the landscape, or the other way around. The cloud sled digital seems encased in this kind of creamy, indeterminate, immaterial digital material. So here's just another view of the legs of the cloud sled that are seemingly integrated with this new digital material. And just we're zooming in a little bit closer. So then here's a close-up of the legs and these new bones that seem to appear through the photogrammetry. And this one, if I can get it going, is actually going. Yeah, so here we see this new form occupying the digital space, and atmosphere, scale, weight, gravity, context of the original model are all like they've kind of fallen away. So the facet of the experiment then, it introduced yet another complexity to the project. Are these mesh models now a new project? What can these new landscapes and attached artifacts share with us? What new meanings may emerge or surface? And then now it wants to just go on its own. If I do that. Yes. So then just pushing to the speculative aspect even more. This is the final view of the cloud sled, which presents the object simply as a burst of data. So then on to case study 2. Barbara.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah. So good morning as well. Thank you for the introduction, Michelle, and thank you for the invitation to this conference. We have our own individual studio practices, but like to come together in a collaborative effort to contextualize our research creation by reading together, by creating larger frameworks and theoretical discussion. Here we show you another case study, namely my own work series, that speaks to the iterative aspect of making and digital space that we are both interested in complicating, but also theorizing and studying as potential public arena for our works. I show you a selection of raw files from the Photoshop photo shoot in situ. Here in the pink text, you might just see this from the back of the room. We are demonstrating some typical digital file description. And in blue, we present the potential for the layered and complex stories around the digital images. We propose that the concept of metadata as the container for details and stories of digital files tends to miss subtle and interesting details. For instance, we want to include the gestures of the pulling of the tissue, the constantly changing sky and light here in northern Scotland, the scaffolding for the image shoot, and so on. This is a view of the thumbnail views of the entire tissue box. For the potential metadata, we include the details such as the entire box of tissues has been processed. The box of tissues is brandless. The sky changes over duration of the performance. The preliminary selection and curation of tissues to tissue form for potential digital printing. We are maintaining the mishaps as part of the conceptual aspect of the work. What you see on screen shows the tissue removed from its context, for use then in the later works potentially with a new sky. Keeping the tissue box opening the same scale for potential animation or setting these points as the constant condition across all photos. And this is a view of the final image, which has gone through 6 steps of processing. And I just name them here for accuracy. So first, I select sky area, which has tonality and color close to the tissue. I resize the sky selection for full print size and DPI quality. Thirdly, I combine the layers of background sky and foreground object. I then position the object in space in a constant coordinate across the series. Number 5, I go to print, and here I did a series on Fabriano paper. And finally, I consider the future of these digital files, such as exhibiting or archival storage. From this process, questions arise. We ask, how do these digital artifacts maintain a connection with their material counterparts? What does the digital artifact want that differs from material versions? How do we manage these iterations, namely the digital, the physical, the conceptual? And we're finally asking how to maintain the connectivity of the object's trajectory and lifespan. This leads us to our proposal to consider the digital space as a public archive and exhibition space. We are looking for alternative space to discuss and theorize, curate, and display aspects of work that may never get presented publicly. Our proposition of public exhibition space considers an artist-driven archival platform using a poetic metadata schema. I'm handing back over to Michelle to speak about metadata now.
Sure. So I won't read the quote here, but just synthesize. So why do we need metadata? To encapsulate and describe our digital artifacts for future use, research, and display. And digital artifacts need descriptions so that digital files can be discoverable. So we have this citation on screen here from the University of North Carolina LibGuide. We also note that there is a metadata schema developed for different disciplines, and including one for cataloging cultural artifacts. We'll speak about that in a second. So we show you some current use examples of metadata. The two examples on the screen here show this kind of generic administrative metadata fields, one from an online generator, and then the black screen below is captured from an Adobe software. And you can see it's actually, they're both using Dublin Core, and it's asking for technical metadata and administrative metadata. So as we mentioned earlier, there are distinct metadata schema being used across disciplines. One schema called Cataloging Cultural Artifacts, which is developed by the Visual Resources Association, inches a little closer to our needs as makers, but it's not quite there. So it seems that no artists were seemingly on the development committee, and the audiences who are meant to use the schema are museums, libraries, archives. This all makes sense. But there's not a lot of mention or talk about the makers of objects as developers or users of the schema, and their intention was to archive the works that are already published in some manner. So our proposal involves rethinking the possibilities of the metadata and the schema, and we propose expanding the fields, opening up to the realities of artist practices. So our proposal is twofold. Design a metadata schema for the maker, or from the maker artist perspective, and then consider the art data as a new way of experiencing digital art. This could be through a kind of poetic or exploratory finding aid, and a digital display which maintains all the metadata that has not yet been captured. So as artists, we think that these artifacts carry and contain all sorts of biographies that enrich the experience of the artifact, like we were trying to show you in our case studies. So we ask, how do we keep the fullness of the story with the object? And what about all the works that have no publishing history, that live outside of these institutional frameworks? So the screen here just shows a zoomed in version of our very speculative metadata fields. And these are merely initial ideas for containers for complex and poetic descriptions, which will, we hope, allow for many types of narratives and authorships. So these new containers, of which we imagine there could be many, allow a complex story to be inscribed and connected to the digital artifact. So a future researcher or viewer could access across a kind of rhizomatic digital package from many different facets. So now here we're starting to fill in the metadata with the artifacts from our case studies. So for the cloud sled model here, we propose some fields as you see on the screen here: the conditions of the making, the object as subject, the experiencing the artifact. Again, just the tip of the iceberg. And here we're trying to encapsulate the potential poetic narratives which surround digital artifacts. And then we understand that these are complex objects and layered narratives. And this slide is a kind of metaphor which posits that the digital artifacts are quite hard to contain and need a wide and deep set of artist-developed metadata fields. And back over to Barbara.
Yeah, so we have just seen a mock setup for Michelle's models, and here we present another propositional archive. This is for my objects. We expanded the set of metadata fields to include here the digital and synthetic surfaces and post-digital aesthetics discussions. We also have a discussion about the Axis and the Baroque, referencing Georges Bataille and Anna Münster. And bear with me, I'm going to expand a little bit on this theory. So of interest here is Anna Münster's discussion of an aesthetic of the digital as Baroque. She claims the Baroque presents, although organized, a folded structure that entwines two important issues for information aesthetics, and I quote, "The production of contemporary embodiment, the corporeal experiences of living in and through information culture, and the relation of this to the aesthetics, epistemological and ontological genealogies," end of quote. Munster's close examination of the digital baroque as a folding, convergence, divergence, flexibility, emergence, and complexity provides useful terminology for thinking about digital media more generally. It demonstrates a theory of multiple aesthetics, including philosophical and scientific crossovers, and knowledge in the digital and post-digital age. Munster calls for theorists to consider digital studies through technological studies, where a diagram of intersecting lines curves through not only code, but further considers aesthetics, society, economics, and silicon. Munster reminds us that digital information differs from natural information in that it needs code translation and analysis to find a representation of form. Her analysis presents us with a useful set of concepts for thinking about digital media and the digital archive as we are pursuing here. So, to come to our preliminary reflections, we ask, what do we preserve for the digital archive? Is it a set of JPEGs, code files, surface maps, visual screenshots, or other file forms that we presented here? How can original physical objects strive in a digital space? We ask, what is the interface to find and experience these artifacts and their stories? How do we future-proof, make platforms cross-jurisdictional, extensible, and interoperable? And lastly, through conceptualizing this open access art archive, we can see the digital archive becoming a public space.
Think back to me. We have no conclusions. They are unconclusions. So our digital artifacts present themselves outside of physical realities, moving from the material world to the digital data world without losing the qualities of this physicality, materiality, tactility, and relatability. We do acknowledge that Second Life platform, the platform has existed for some time, but we're interested in the relationship of the material objects and their digital iterations and then their public display. So we are also aware that there are potential issues when developing any kind of online platform. What do you do about authorship? Who authors the metadata? What about the potential for corrupting the history of the object? Where is the data farm located? And we inherit many contemporary issues around data security, copywriting, hacking, censorship. This is huge, but we don't want that to stop us from thinking about this project. So there are real issues to work through, obviously, through a future phase of the larger ongoing project. But we hoped to reveal through our case studies the hidden, seemingly unremarkable biographies of digital artifacts, and further suggest a way to keep this object and its stories interconnected. And finally, we're continuing this research through the Data Materialization Studio Lab at OCAD, and welcome any interested collaborators. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
You can always share. Michelle and I can share.
Yeah,
Can
yeah,
we?
yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yes.
No.
This is for streaming. Should I put anything on the screen here?
That's nice. What should we put on the screen?
Should we put anything on the screen?
Mm.
Something fun? it's not my computer. I don't want to start messing around. Yeah.
Je remercie au nom de les panélistes. Thank you very much for your fascinating presentations. I'll turn to the public right now if you have questions, and after them if you don't.
I wanted to react to the work of Deborah. I really love your presentation.
Yeah.
As we are talking about images, so I really saw an image that became material in your work, and I made some connections between the pixels of the image that I can perceive in your work. Of these details of mistakes or manual working while you are finishing with one color and then switching into another one. So you see this kind of imperfections. Maybe is not the perfect word to make a reference, but I do this connection between pixels and something small that makes unity, that makes this kind of unity. And then also I connect this image to the image of sound. Let's think maybe about the vital signs in heart beating. So this thing that is not a unique sequence, but it's something that is always changing. And this is related to life, the beating and life, and then what is behind your materiality is life finally. So I really love that. And my question was about how do you present the whole process of the work? So you have the final result, the object indeed. But then I was asking myself if when you expose that, you expose also something that tells about the process, some photograph as we saw, or texts, or so which are the supports that are behind your work.
Thank you so much for that reading. There's so many ways that I could pick that up and talk about the work that I had been doing theoretically and in performance around quantum physics and the way in which you refer to how the micro can actually manifest in the larger. So that picks up. And then the notion of linking the materiality, the image, the materiality, and the sound is also really, really stimulating. I really appreciate all of those comments. So the question about how the work is presented, the reason why I had taken the work apart initially after the first iteration, after 8 weeks of crocheting every day for 5 hours a day, was because there was something about that immateriality, there was something about the ephemeral experience that felt that felt necessary to keep active. And if I kept the object at that moment, then in French we say figé. It would have been fixed. It would have been frozen in time. The most relevant way of sharing this project is through the stories, is through the encounters and the people who came and shared with me, the woman on the mountain who wanted to have me break the rules. I mean, that's a whole other piece that I can talk about, is what happens when you install a set of rules and then the public changes the rules, right? So this woman who knew right from the start, because I said I'm only crocheting in purple when you're with me, and she, just before she left, she said, I'm on my way to the funeral of my best friend who died in suicide. And as I go, I would really want you to maintain the crocheting in yellow for the length of the funeral, because I can't bear to be there alone. So that notion of how that thread shift, that break in story, that break in the code of the binary code, I could have shown you on the line exactly where it was, because that binary code was a memory stick for me, right? So I knew exactly from that pattern and from that place where it was. But I felt that if I left it as the object, then the stories would not have the same type of freedom, if you will, as the experiences themselves. In the second iteration, because the curators wanted something to have on the shelf, I insisted that the only reference to the material object should be the stories, which is why I took a day from crocheting to teach the docents how to read the piece, right? And so what people encountered were the stories, were the people who shared that work. And I think that's where the strength of our agency in the public sphere is in this exchange of storied, emotion-laden realities that bump into each other and sometimes create friction and sometimes create resonance, but always create some type of possibility for thinking together in a different way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have just a follow-up question. I also really love the presentation of the piece. It's really, really intriguing and wonderful. I have one issue, I think, where it connects back to the story, right? Because what I really liked about the piece was also that there's your care, but there's also abstraction from the story. And when you have someone else to retell the story, there's a potential problem. Same with putting the story on Facebook, right? So I'm wondering how you manage that transmission / translation, mistranslation, misrepresentation that could possibly happen.
Yes, I'm almost tempted to ask Jocelyn to answer that question because of the way that she reinterpreted the experiences, not only through the photographs, but also through the drawings. And I guess my question back to you is there such a thing as a misrepresentation? Right? There are different interpretations, and that's the liveness. That's the co-creativity, is that everyone encountering this work in the ways in which it creates multiplicities of meanings and multiplicities of layers. There's no, just like there's no unique and uniform public, there's no unique and uniform story. And in fact, that's the reason to keep the stories alive, is that every time you tell the story, it changes.
Right. So you're not claiming any authentic retelling, and then
No.
it just goes down.
And maybe Jocelyn does want to answer something about what it meant for her to intervene in the way that she did.
Je vais répondre en français, c'est possible, je pense que le monde comprenne assez bien. Mais en fait, ce qui est vraiment intéressant dans la présentation de cette performance-là, c'est que l'objet qui est initialement là est pas, ok, tu dis une kippa qui devient un cocon. Alors, il y a beaucoup d'interprétations là aussi. Alors, comment je pourrais dire ça, non? On pourrait faire juste un discours sur ces deux objets qui se transforment, alors qu'on aurait oublié toutes les histoires, et aussi le fait qu'à la fin, tout ça devient comme une mémoire tout à fait... quand tu l'as défait, c'était admirable parce qu'il y avait comme quelque chose de très émouvant, parce que c'était un travail que tu t'étais appliqué à faire avec tout ce qui était inscrit dedans. Et quand c'est tombé par terre, c'est comme, la mémoire, c'est aussi ça, c'est une espèce de magma de choses que chacun reprend et interprète à sa façon. Alors, ce travail-là a vraiment des couches et des couches et des couches qu'on pourrait vraiment avoir des discussions très longues avec ça. Je pense que c'est pour ça qu'il touche tant le monde aussi.
My question is for Ruth. I want to thank you for moderating public art research. It's something I look forward to pretty much every day because you're very active and it's very generous of you for doing that. I was thinking about the fact that not that many people publish on public art research, and why I've never shared anything, I think, or maybe once, in the group, and I think I see you as the curator of the content that is on that page, in that group, and I think you have a couple co-curators that are colleagues from Australia. So that's just something that came to my mind. What's the other thing I wanted to say? I was wondering if you had a chance to look at the content of what's published in the group. I think that would be a very interesting review of very different review of literature to do based on the content of the group. I think that like to see what interests people in Australia versus in other parts of the world.
Two things that I might need a reminder to come back to that last one. I guess my intention, well, the lineage of the thing, the public art research, is certainly as a source of pushing out information. The Facebook group's been interesting, and WordPress to a lesser extent, in learning what social media analysts have known for, since it began, that putting stuff online isn't enough. If you want engagement and interaction and you want to build a community, or build some sort of interactions. And that's strategically, I guess that's not been an issue so much for me, because what I'm doing is finding things and saving them by sending them out into the world to be archived and stored and repurposed by other people, including myself. But I do, as you're suggesting, often think about what could I be doing to foster a different kind of conversation. And it's partly the kind of constant shift of, less constant, but the shift in platforms is thinking about how to do that. But then it's not about platforms, it's about using multiple platforms and multiple opportunities differently. I mean, I think this conference is an example of one of those interconnections between us. Certainly the work in Melbourne, my connections with people in Melbourne is about human connections that connect up with those different Facebook groups and how they work. So there's, what's not visible in that map are the friend networks and the other kinds of interconnections. So anyway, I'm saying I agree with you. Yes, it's something I think about, and if you've got any suggestions about what might be, I mean, my personal needs are being satisfied by sending this stuff out there. But I guess it would be, there are opportunities to do things differently for sure.
Well, I appreciate reading what you. I don't feel like I want to publish anything in the group to be satisfying enough to read what you're sending out.
I mean, the usual frustration of people doing this kind of work, as I'm sure you know from administrative work as well, is actually wanting other people to provide some sort of hint. So yes, I'll sign you up as an Perfect. Your second point was content.
Yeah, you're producing a very singular review of literature, considering there's a number of calls also for conferences and books going on, and not just the end result of research. So I think that would be I don't know if you look at the content historically, how the proposals have changed, how geographically.
Okay. I see what you mean. I haven't done that, and I guess I've been reluctant to even think about that, partly because I know that I've posted most of the material there. So it's kind of, what does that mean that I'm looking at it? But as you're saying, to look at the changes in that material rather than what the material covers or doesn't cover, it would actually be quite interesting. Yeah. Thanks.
I'll ask the questions for Michelle and Barbara. So we've been speaking about the agency of subjects a lot, but we've been addressing the agency of the object and the image, I feel, more specifically. And I've been curious to hear you about, because metadata schemes they work into a logic of utility and homogenization for libraries. And the problem when you appropriate
Yeah.
those metadata schemes is that they have to work with different platforms
Sure.
and be understood by a large number of people. So the tendency is to
Streamline.
yeah,
I know.
right, to go to the essential information like artist,
Yeah.
medium, and that way you have a guarantee that it's understood. And so I'm interested to hear what you have to say about your speculative metadata scheme to conserve the storytelling of the object.
Well, we don't have a schema yet. This is a speculative kind of a thought experiment. And it's we keep coming up against these, we've done another project together where we looked at the edges of software where it's meant to be welcoming artists and makers. And this was a Google Quick Draw project. And we found ourselves wanting to mess with things instantly. And the same thing happened with this concept of a archive. And it's like, well, what about all the stories that are attached to these digital objects? Not just ours, but everything that we've been looking at today. What about the sound pieces and like the stories of the making? We just used our two examples as just to put something and see how it fits in a schema and that's not even a presentation idea yet. But how do you maintain the stories while making it accessible? I totally understand that metadata needs, there's a consistency, but then can you dive in? I think Barbara's quote from Anna Munster, like the folding, like how do you allow for that? And we don't have an answer. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah.
But please come to Toronto and hang out at the lab and do some workshops with us, because we're interested in these conversations and thinking about getting a number of people that are interested in like, what could these categories be? What stories do we want to capture? And then what do you do with all these fields? And maybe nothing.
Maybe just adding a little bit of kind of make it more complicated.
Yeah.
It's almost the opposite of the
Streamlining.
Streamlining, because life is complicated and making art is complicated. So we are complicating the data.
Yeah.
And for our previous project, we looked into the feminist principles that was actually related to data materialization. But we have feminist principles that we are adding on to. So we are obviously, again, inviting people to add onto the existing feminist principles. And
make
one
things
would be
transparent.
make things transparent, but
Yeah.
also keep the complications in.
Yeah.
The layeredness, the multifaceted aspects. And I think the first question that was raised to you, Deborah, I think was addressing this, you're crocheting the noise that you make with the needle, or, dropping the ball of yarn, that might be picked up by a playing kid. So how do we keep those beautiful little details that make our day, in the making and the history of the object? So I'm glad you brought up the agency of the material, because that's another layer that we didn't really go into detail, but there is an ask from the material as well. So if I'm working in wood or plastic, or am I addressing the full history of the plastic material when I'm just doing a quick image of, for this archive? Am I addressing the decaying of the object? How well does it peak? So you're repeating your performance 20 years after the first iteration. So that is changing. The performance, you have changed, but also society has changed. So how do we narrate the iteration of the object, or how the concept changes over the changes of the society? That's in short. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes.
I just want to add something to that and add one other story to this. So when I did the piece in 2017, I really wanted to explore a different materiality physically. So the first time was with cotton. The second time I ended up using silk, different colors. And one of the people who came the first week that I was in France, at the city hall, she had come in because she needed a paper for her son. was really fascinating, all of the city hall bureaucracy, why people would come up to the office. And she looked at me and she said, I know that material. I said, wow, okay, how do you know that material? Because I was going on about how, it comes in these really big skeins and it wasn't so easy to get, and she said, yes, I know that material. I crochet for surgeons using this material, so that in surgeries, when the person needs to have a reconstructed vertebrae, she crochets the sheaths for the vertebrae in silk so that they can stay in the body.
Right.
And it was a completely different use of that same material. And then she went on about how this material was the only one that they could use because of its purity and because of the fact that they had no dyes in this particular color and all the rest of this kind of stuff. So there is absolutely something about the choice and the agency of the material that you speak to and that you elicited that has everything to do with what does that material offer us by way of manifestation, right?
Yeah.
And what can a crocheted object do? What can the crochet material do, whether it's cotton or silk or something else? So just a little tidbit about that.
Beautiful.
Thank you. But that's the folded story that we're talking about. How do you maintain that beautiful line as well within the story? Tricky.
I'd love to ask more questions, but we can continue over lunch.
Sure.
Oh, vas-y.
Juste dire que le lunch est downstairs comme d'habitude, toujours les bienvenus. Et puis cet après-midi, on commence à 14h à la Maison de la Culture, de l'autre côté de la rue. If you want to translate. Et les portes sont ouvertes à 13h30. Can you do that, Ivana?
So lunch is downstairs, everybody's welcome. This afternoon begins at 2:00 in the Maison de la Culture, the other address, which is just down the road, but the doors will open at 1:30.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
So we work to do in the lab.
Exactly.